Hey everyone, welcome. This video continues where we left off with our forms. If you'd like to follow along, I'm using the week 10 demo forms out in Blackboard. In this particular video, I'm going to cover styling your forms. I'm going to open up my forms folder in VS Code, going straight to my HTML, CSS, and then I'm going to rearrange all of my windows to get everything just where I want it to be. That looks good. So let's get started. By default, our forms don't look very stylish, and understanding which elements are inline and block level is going to help us to understand how best to style our forms. Now, a form element is a block level element, so that means it expands to the full width of its container. The container for our form is the main element, so however large our main element is, our form is filling that space. For example, let me put a border around our form. And you can kind of see it, but it's so pushed up against the main element, it's hard to tell, so I'm going to reduce the form to about 50%. Now you can see it's about half of our main element. Let's push it right into the center of our main element by using that margin 0 and auto property and value pair. This allows us to have an equal margin on both the right side and the left side. I'll use the shortcut property where 0 is for the top and the bottom, and auto is for the left and the right. That's better, but our text is really up against the border and it's too tight. We want to have a little bit of space in there, so I'm going to add some padding. That looks better. Let's figure out some way to line up our text boxes. I'm going to show you two ways. Because legibility is so important when it comes to forms, it helps our end users to not make mistakes when they're filling out that form. For us, the label and the input elements are both inline elements, so they don't automatically go to their own line. But because we have a small viewport right now and an absolute value on the size of our input for our first name, things really aren't lining up well. Let's take a look at the display property because we can change the behavior of our inline elements to behave more like a block level element. To do this, I'm going to add the display block property value pair to the input element. That does look better. I can see we have a lot of extra breaks in our form. Just from when we were creating the HTML, I'm going to remove a few of those break elements to help clean this up. That looks a little bit more consistent. Now with our display block property, it makes each input element go to its own line, but it doesn't really look so good for our radio buttons and our checkboxes. So we can make a little adjustment where we add the attribute selector to target only those inputs that have the type equal to text or to the type equal to password, or maybe just to our text area element. I'm going to open up my CSS page just a little bit wider. Okay, we do have some improvements that are being made. Things are visibly looking a little bit better. Now, since these elements are behaving more like a block level element, we can add or increase the width of those elements so that they span to the entire width of their container, in this case, the form element. I'll use width of 100% because that will automatically be adjusted by whatever padding we already put in place. Still looking a lot better, but let's add some height to our text area element. That way it more accurately looks like a text area where we're allowing the users to enter in more text value. That does look pretty good. That's one option, where we're putting inputs on their own line. Another option that we could go with is using fixed widths for our labels. Let me draw a box around all of our labels, and it's just going to be here temporarily. Now there's some things that we can notice right away. Since the label element is an inline element, the next element is going to start where the label ends. That's what causes our form to look a little bit jagged. We want things to line up where it starts and stops in the same space. We can adjust our label elements in the HTML by adding a class attribute to each one and then setting a fixed width property. But because we set our first name, last name, and password where the input is inside of the label, that won't necessarily work too well. Let me show you that as an example. I'm going to add a class to each label for my first name, last name, and password. Now with that fixed width set in there, let me add that selector, and I'm going to set the display property to inline block. When we use inline block, It gives the label the characteristics of both the inline and the block level elements, meaning it stays on the same line like an inline element, but now we can add width and height to that property. So if we were to add a width of about 130 pixels to those three labels, watch where they start and end with that red border. It forces them all to start and stop in the same place, so that our inputs would line up perfectly, because the label and the input are both inline, so they start and stop where the last one ends. I'm going to add that fixed width class attribute to all of my labels that have an input, a radio button, or a checkbox. And I'm going to speed up the video so you don't have to watch this part. Now that I have those on there, watch what happens when I resize my windows now. Every time that my radio button, label, or input has to break to a new line, it takes the other one with it, so they're not leaving anything behind. That keeps our form nice and clean. Let's go ahead and remove that border around our label. I think all we need to do now is line up our label and our inputs for our first name, last name, and password. Let's see what we have going on with those right now. Our label for the first name, last name, and password all already have a class equal to fixed width, and we used that to set our property to inline block and a width of 130 pixels. But we also have attribute selectors setting the properties to display block with a width of 100%. Those two things are a little bit in conflict, and we also have our inputs sitting inside of our label for those three elements. So we need to make some adjustments or changes to get those to all sort of work a little bit better together. The goal is to have a fixed width on our label where the input starts in the same space, or the goal is to have the width span 100% across the form and act like a block level element. Either way, I think we'll need to remove the input from the label. So let's start by doing that. Okay, we accomplished one mission, and that was we were able to now have it go all the way across the form. So we can either leave it this way and pull out that fixed width class because it doesn't do us any good, or we could try and make it so that our inputs and our labels are on the same line and that they work together in harmony. I'm going to choose to leave it as is. And the reason I want to do that is because if our form changes size, I want these to still look like they stay together. That was the whole reason why we put the input inside the label in the first place. Let's go ahead and move our form around and resize it to test things out to see how it looks. I would say the only improvement we could make at this point is whether or not we want to have our payment type selection break to its own line in the same manner. But I think the way that it's working right now is still pretty good. So I'm going to leave that one just like it is. So with that, there's two different ways that you can style a form to get those inputs to line up. Whether or not you have inputs on their own line, or if you specify some sort of a fixed width. Always make sure you test your form though in several viewport sizes to make sure that your elements are staying together and that it looks good in multiple views. Let's continue on with styling some other things. Let's move on to those field sets and those legends. We'll change the way that the field set and legends appear by overriding the default. I'm going to go ahead and set my field set to remove that gray border, but then I'm going to add a background color and a border radius to give that field set a little dimension. Now I'll override the default legend so that it also has that same background color and border radius, but then I'm going to add padding to push that background color out a little away from the text, and then I'll change the font a bit to make it easier to see. Those look pretty good. Let's try some more styles. Let's change those buttons so that that default plain style is overwritten. We're going to use that attribute selector again to target just the inputs where the type is submit and reset so that we're not affecting any of the other input elements that are out there. I'll add a border, round the edges with a radius, put in some padding to push the text away from the border, and then I'll also modify that text again, like I did with the legend. That looks pretty good. Let's make it so that when we hover on them, it changes that background color and makes the font white. And we'll test this out. That looks pretty good. Okay, let's move on to the last thing. Let's center those buttons into the middle of the form. But when it comes to centering buttons, this can be a little bit tricky. Let me scroll my code up. And I'm going to go into my HTML and show you the buttons on our form. When it comes to the inputs, those are an inline element. Now, usually when we want to center something that's an inline element, we're centering the text, so we use the text align center. But in this case, we can't use that because if you look at our buttons right now, the text is already aligned in the center. That's a default behavior from the browser. And it's only targeting the text that's on the button, so we can't use text align center. And because the input element is an inline element, we can't use margin 0 and auto because that's a property that's associated to a block level element. So that puts us in a unique situation. We need to find an alternative solution. We're going to use a generic element called the div element to wrap around our inputs, and then we'll tag it with a unique identifier. Now we can use this div to target our buttons a little bit differently. And since we know we're going to use this unique identifier, let me go into our CSS and add that in right away. First, I'll draw a border around that div. Now, if I try to use margin 0 and auto, what that's focusing on is the div element itself. But notice that the div element is already centered on the form. It's a block level element, and in this case, there's nothing to center. So we can't use margin 0 and auto. But what we can do is we can use text align center, because that's applying the centering property value pair to all of the inline elements contained inside of our div. Notice how the buttons are now lining up on the center of our div. This would apply to any inline element that we were to put inside of the div. So if we had an image or a span element inside of our div, that would also be in the center. So that was a lot of information on styling forms, and if you have any questions on this material, please don't hesitate to ask.